Next, we have Peggy Nash, who she has a very long CV. I could talk about her politics. She was an NDP member at one time. She's a political activist. She was a negotiator with the CAW, now Unifor, and she's now with the Center for Labor Management at Ryerson. The next speaker was David Rapaport, who, what can I say? He's an old friend. He's an OPSEU member. He's at Trent University now. He was an activist at OPSEU. He was also a board member, and he was a candidate for president at least twice. And so we have a mix here of practitioners and academics. Finally, we have Roxane Dubois, who is a director of strategic planning and development. I love that title, with Unifor. And she's going to talk about the recent lockout, which I'm excited to hear about. So I won't take any more time. We should start with John. You have the floor.
Okay, let me get this newfangled share screen going. Okay, I think we're good. That's okay. Bob came up with the idea, which I liked very much, that I'd start things off by talking about a paper I did in 2010, published in 2011, about Richard Hyman's book, Strikes. This is a book that was done for a symposium for Richard when he was ostensibly retiring. Of course, he's still editor of the European Journal of IR. But Strikes, the book that I'm talking about, that this paper talks about, and that I'll go beyond a bit today, and I'm just going to do this to set up some questions. Strikes was published in 1972. It went to 4 editions. Final edition, I think, was in 1988. And of course, it was published at the height of industrial unrest in the UK in particular, but generally, and especially in liberal market economies. And it was a major formative influence on me. I went to Cornell, to the IR school, to do my PhD in 1975, I think it was. And here I was by day, sitting in classrooms, listening to, and I speak very well of people like Tom Kochen and just as excellent scholars. But they were all kind of or they were all very pluralist in their orientation. And a lot of them were very positivist, quantitative work, social science rules, et cetera, et cetera. And I was sitting there by day, and it wasn't what I was looking for. And I discovered Strikes kind of wandering through a bookstore one day. Cornell had a really great off-campus bookstore, and started reading it. And it was, if anyone's familiar with Richard Hyman, he would consider himself a Marxist. I don't want to get into a debate as to what a Marxist is or is not, but I think he would still consider himself that. So this was very anti-pluralist, very critical of pluralism, very critical of quantitative work, if only implicitly. I have to say I haven't been able to read it for some time because it's stuck in lockdown in my office at the university, where I haven't been for 6 months. It was very much all about the relationship between structure and action, and for kind of understanding how strikes operate and industrial relations more generally. And it really screwed up my graduate school training and subsequent early career. I couldn't reconcile it in particular with the perspective I could, but I couldn't figure out how to incorporate it within kind of a North American social science frame. And so that and a number of things meant that I probably set a record in the length of time it took to complete my PhD. It was roughly a decade, I think, by the time it was done. And, you know, the people on my doctoral committee were so fed up, but I don't think any of them just read it. They just kind of waved me through, which was nice of them because it wasn't a great dissertation. But I kind of then figured it out and how to, and have subsequently, Hyman's work really has formed the basis for most, if not all, of what I've done, and kind of an underlying perspective that derives how I think about my research and how I think about industrial relations. And I've published various tracts about this and various sources, and they're all really obscure. They don't seem to interest the soul. But anyway, I did this 2000, and it came out in 2011 in the BJIR as part of a symposium honoring Richard's career. And I wanted to further develop the basic argument in strikes and address what actually had happened, seemed to have happened to strike activity since he wrote this book in the early 70s. Now, the core argument of strikes was that strikes, and as you would expect from a Marxist, and various forms of conflict are endemic to capitalism, and that they're only likely to increase over time. He talks about the structure of the capitalist employment relation, and he talks about developmental tendencies in capitalism, which he identifies as, you have to remember, this is back in 1972, alienation, management control systems, etc. He sees these as kind of increasing over time, the tendency towards strike activity. And he talks about various sources of cooperation. It's sort of how I do my undergraduate course. By the time I get through the sources of conflict, the question is, why isn't everybody out picketing on the streets all the time? And so he talks about sources of cooperation, which again, these are very force of habit, social values. These are very much topics that were starting to bubble up in British industrial relations at the time. And the argument was that these sources didn't like negate the sources of conflict. The sources of conflict are still there. They don't go away. What they do is a good Marxist, they contradict them. And so what he ended up kind of concluding is that strikes are inherent to capitalism and can even be expected to increase over time rather than, and I put in quotes, wither away, which was a popular thesis in the 1960s. A book by Ross and Hartman basically argued that strikes were going to wither away as the post-war system of collective bargaining matured and started to work more effectively. Yet this is exactly what seems to have happened, beginning in the early to mid 70s and continuing up to the present time. Strikes have withered away, more or less. And here's, this is from the, I actually managed to dig this out went way back in my computer files and found this. And this is just a graph. Strike statistics are notoriously bad. They're collected differently in different countries. And for example, I think in the US now, a strike of under 1,000 workers isn't counted in the strike statistics. So this is just something that I essentially plagiarized from a book that had been published in 2007, which covers data for the UK, US, Canada, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, Australia, and New Zealand. And it shows very well this trend in strikes. You know, for someone, to me, it's very meaningful because when I went to graduate school, it was essentially to study about strikes. That was the front page news in the day. So essentially you can see this trend, and I'll skip back to that in a minute. And so there really, you have to say, well, and Hyman got it completely wrong. And so what was wrong with his argument? One, which is, I think was an almost universal failing at the time, but is a bad thing to criticize a Marxist for, is that he wasn't paying enough attention to the point in history he was writing. And the conditions supporting the post-war settlement had begun to break down in the late 60s. And my article talks about this. And this is what gave rise to this, largely gave rise with this upward spike in strike activity. He was also tending to mistake the British experience for a kind of a universal tendency of capitalism. He was underplaying the importance of what I call national institutional environments to this breakdown. Social market economies were much more equipped to deal with it. And this is the other graph from my article. I can't show the whole thing at once, but you can look at the comparison on the left side, the UK, the USA, and Canada. Of course, Canada, we've always excelled at strikes. We've always, of the major kind of developed nations, I think we've always come out on top. But you can see that you definitely had these spikes. But if you look over to the other side of the page, you'll see that Germany, when you put them on the same metric, had virtually, much less. There was a spike in the early 70s, but just bringing it up to what was normal for Canada. The Netherlands is another country that I could get data for. Same thing. And Sweden, of course, also the same thing, except that they had a major rupture in 1980 in bargaining. But you can essentially see that a lot of people were kind of celebrating the 70s as this time of resistance and industrial strife. I don't know, Bob might know better than I, these might just be happenstance choices, but it looks very much to me, and I think for very good reasons, I talk about it in the article, that this was primarily a phenomenon for what we now call liberal market economies, as opposed to what over here, I guess you can call coordinated or social market economies. So that was his second kind of flaw in his argument. The third is that another thing, bad thing to criticize a Marxist for was, again, underestimating the importance of history as it unfolds in the future. He was essentially assuming that history was linear, that we were on this upward trajectory of strikes, and this would continue indefinitely. He of course didn't anticipate anything like neoliberalism, which would have been a bizarre thing to argue in the early 70s. I mean, people would never imagine that it would take hold. But essentially, what he was doing is underestimating this, and how, and people can debate this statement, it's a bit strong, how the kind of the neoliberal era would end strikes as a viable manifestation of conflict. And his assumption was that, of course, that the main manifestation of conflict was strikes and always would be. And that was his fourth kind of mistake, assuming that conflict comes out primarily through strikes. He talked about all sorts of other manifestations of conflict in his book, but his essential argument, and this was kind of a conflict in the book, the claim is he wrote it in 10 weeks in the summer of 1971 or something. I mean, it was one of these kind of, he was a new scholar, he just finished his PhD, he was at work, and it was just kind of like, if you've ever been an academic and you've ever been fresh from academic life, you just kind of have this stuff that's all built up inside you that just comes out, and that's essentially what strikes was. But we can still accept this basic argument, and my paper tries to finesse this a little bit more clearly about these sources of conflict. And we can restrict our analysis to liberal market economies when we talk about that, because there is much in social market economies that overcome these sources. Forms of co-determination in Germany, the financial structure of firms and how they're managed in Sweden as well. And I don't know that much about the Netherlands, but my recollection is that they used to have a extensive, what they called even a central planning council, which looked after kind of coordinating bargaining, etc. So you had all these mechanisms in place in social market economies, which essentially said, okay, you need to not make arguments about capitalism in general. You need to look, and you can make grand arguments, if you will, but you also need to look at how institutional differences mediate what it is you're talking about. And that's very much the case here, and it's very much the case in everything I do now, where you can look at liberal market economies, and they really are, although social market economies seem to be succumbing somewhat to the pressures of global neoliberalism, they've still remained largely social market economies. Of course, countries like Canada and the US and Britain haven't even been able to buffer themselves against these pressures, so they've become even more liberal. But nonetheless, you can essentially say that, okay, well, what if we just limit this, accept his arguments about conflict, and limit our analysis to liberal market economies? Then the question that comes, where is the conflict gone in liberal market economies? There's been nothing, there's still these underlying sources of conflict. You would have expected some decline in strike activity after the period of the early 1970s, but you know, you wouldn't have expected it to have been as prolonged and as continuous. So where did it go? And one is just that Hyman's argument is wrong. I think I established fairly well in the article that there's no reason to argue that. I kind of have a Marxist analysis of what caused the conflict, why there was lesser strike activity before the 70s, why the strike activity went up, and it all had to do with having institutions that constrain the manifestation of this conflict.
John, can you wrap up in about 2 minutes?
Okay, and yeah, I've got that right here. So there are 4 possibilities that I address in this paper, and I think Bob wanted me to do that so that people wanted to discuss which of these they thought was most useful, we could do that. It would give something to talk about. One is the diversion thesis. This is the Hebdon thesis, actually. Bob does this work which shows that when strikes are not allowed in the public sector, you get higher grievance rates. So there are all kinds of other ways that conflict might be manifest. If you're not able to strike, you know, it's kind of a well-worn claim that you end up engaging in other acts of resistance, or you're more likely to quit because you can't, quote unquote, exercise voice. You're more likely to be absent. You're more likely to file health and safety claims. And so essentially the argument, and this is something called the balloon thesis, where you can think of conflict as a balloon. If you squeeze it in one area, you have more air in the other. So if you squeeze strikes down, then what you see is the other area of this balloon getting larger. That's one argument. The second, of course, is the triumph of capitalism. Better conditions of work. Management's got its act together would be the argument here. Much more sophisticated management, much less kind of arbitrary exercise of authority in the workplace. Better HR departments, wellness programs, et cetera, better pay and benefits, which in the UK they did see for a couple of decades. But there's also, of course, the dark side of this is kind of more sophisticated control and monitoring systems, heightened coercion, and of course, dominant managerial ideologies, which are teamism, presenteeism, which are all kind of fostering potentially at least the culture of compliance. The third possible argument is what I call the embeddedness thesis, which is manifesting a conflict in some overt way, or even through grievances and health and safety claims, always gets you into trouble. You give up and become disengaged, and you don't have a union probably in the first instance. So you just have this general malaise and disengagement in particular. We've now got in management schools, I think still this crisis of engagement they talk about. And it's completely comes out of nowhere. Nobody working in a management school, except certainly in my place, except me, has ever come close to taking a course in labor relations. So they have no concept that maybe there are deeper reasons for these problems. But you have all of these various problems. And I argue in another paper that perhaps what we've now got is a culture of instrumentality, where people are just out for themselves more than ever, have given up on trying to be part of something broader, don't really care about their work, do what they have to do, get stressed, but really focus on consumption and just totally instrumental. Finally, there's the dormancy thesis, which is sort of a John Kelly thesis. If you know John Kelly, who's another British academic who I think he'd still claim that he's Marx. He'd say he was a Marxist, but also certainly not a dogmatic kind of quoting from Capital Marxist. Anyway, conflict is repressed, so that its manifestation is suppressed, but it's not lost. The conflict's still there. This is kind of like thinking of that there's a virus out there and it's just kind of hiding below the surface, if eventually it's going to get touched off by political and economic events, these are going to render and you know the current crisis is kind of
okay, John. Thanks, John.
Give me a second. But the question here is the conflict gets manifest, but not necessarily at the workplace. It's outside of the workplace, and that's what I call deinstitutionalization. So,
good point to end on. Thank you, Peggy Nash.
Okay, let me, I cannot share my screen. Hang on. Share screen. There we go. Share. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, John. I very much enjoyed your paper, and I used it as the basis for my presentation, so I'll refer to it throughout. And I don't have an academic paper to present. I just have, as was said before, some experience in collective bargaining and in Parliament, and I applied it to this. And why won't my, There we go. Hang on. So as John said, everything changed in the 70s. Business went on the offensive to lower costs and increase control. You know, I was working at Air Canada in the 1970s. It was a Crown corporation and in a highly regulated industry. And then all hell broke loose because it was privatized. And of course, following the US lead, the transportation sector was deregulated. And I saw firsthand the upshot of thousands of people losing their jobs, companies going bankrupt, and certainly an attack on working conditions. And I also saw that in free trade. And I mean, we know all of these aspects of neoliberalism, free trade, the use of technology, sometimes in a coercive way, outsourcing high-paid jobs, insourcing low-paid jobs, and the legislative changes that underpin this drive to lower costs and the competitiveness agenda that was overriding everything. And something that sent huge ripple effects through the labor movement at the time was the breaking of the PATCO strike. And for those of you who weren't born then, this was a bargaining unit of highly skilled workers, air traffic controllers, who had supported Ronald Reagan in his leadership, in his presidential campaign. And when they went on strike, he was so infuriated that he basically shut down the union. Everybody was fired, and he went about replacing the air traffic controllers. So that certainly sent a huge ripple through the labor movement. And similarly in Britain with the miners' strike, the notion of Margaret Thatcher that there was no alternative, that this was the modern economy, and strikes and increasing labor rights did not fit in with that agenda. I just thought I'd show this other image. I don't know if you can see it because it's on the right side of the screen, but this other image from 1995. This is from January 1995, and the auto industry was still relatively strong at that point in Canada. These were considered some of the highest paid industrial jobs. And in January 1995, General Motors put out a call for hiring. 26,000 people showed up. Many spent the night lining up, waiting just to put in an application. There were helicopter shots. This was before drones. There were helicopter shots showing the massive lineups. And I don't think anybody actually got hired. I'm not saying it was a PR stunt, but boy, did it send a message of insecurity to workers. If you were unemployed, it was going to be tough to get a job. If you had a good job, my God, you better hang on to it and not complain about it. Okay. So I've given a couple of examples. These weren't just a few bad apples. This was, as they say in the Black Lives Matter movement, this was a bad system. It was, in fact, designed to ratchet down wages and become more exploitative. But there were mixed results. Yes, some employers went on the offensive. I have been in workplace occupations where mounted police were called in, really frightening situations. But many employers have just carried on. And it's not that they were easy at the bargaining table. They have carried on and kept the employment, the collective bargaining relationship going and building that relationship. There were certainly failed strikes, but there were also some successes. I mean, John's point is that strikes have declined dramatically. No one can argue with that. And I think for all of the context reasons, I think that workers came to understand that message that you can't push your luck too far because, you know, if you're in manufacturing, you're competing with Mexico, then you're competing with Asia. I mean, it's many argued against the competitiveness agenda because once you go down that rabbit hole, workers are guaranteed to lose. But clearly wages have not kept pace, and the bulk of the profits from GDP growth obviously have gone to the top. We've lost hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs, and yet union density in Canada has not suffered all that much, but mainly this is because of the public sector. Now, John has raised alternative forms of conflict, and I would argue often these other forms, these other avenues are blocked. Absenteeism, most people don't have sick pay, occupational health and safety. I used to be a health and safety rep in the workplace, and people tend now to exercise their rights much less often because usually you just get sent back to work. WSIB can take years to resolve. You don't get much from it. Employment standards have not kept pace, obviously. The Labor Relations Act, I would argue, is obviously tipped towards the employers, and enforcement has been lax, often employers enforcing themselves. Has it just been a triumph of capitalism? Do we have better management? I think sometimes we have better informed management, but generally wages have not kept pace. And even those who do make better incomes, they likely have more debt, and they are less likely to take risks. Students coming out of university, they can be armed with all kinds of degrees, but they've got debt. And I think the dominant business messages have, up until recently, dominated our public debate, certainly dominated our governments. Workplace engagement programs, I don't think these ever worked particularly well. I don't think people are fools, and they often see through it. I thought it was really interesting, John's point in his paper about coercive control and the erosion of the will to struggle. I think he makes a very good point on people internalizing that negative message, and that message coming through them in ways that are negative to people's health and social relations. And yet the employment relation remains. And so John asks in his paper, is this a Pyrrhic victory that management seems to be winning? And he talks about this employee engagement deficit, which I thought was quite an amusing term. But I do agree that worker passivity has led in some cases to dysfunction. But I would argue that it is changing in a way that we don't fully understand yet. After the crash of 2008, we saw the Occupy movement. And while many would argue it was a failed movement, nothing was achieved, it did two things. It focused attention on the 1%, and it exposed inequality. It may have led to a rise in cynicism and a rise in populism. That's an interesting area to explore. So is there still a role for collective action? I would argue yes, unreservedly. Workers always have to have the ability to withdraw their labor. Whether they choose to use it when conditions aren't favorable, they always have to have, and even if it's not given by law, they'll take it. But workplace resistance will remain important. And collective bargaining continues. As I say, vast majority of agreements are resolved, and workers and the employer come to a conclusion that they can live with. And even where, and another panelist will talk about this, but even where you have a long, bitter lockout, like recently took place in Saskatchewan, where clearly the intent was to destroy the union, just standing one day longer and going back with your head held high and beating back some of the worst employer demands, that, it's a win, it's a partial win. Most workers, if they were given the chance, would join a union. We saw the Foodora workers. Again, their victory was to establish the right that even though their employer claimed to be an app, that the employer in fact was the employer directing the work relationship. And 90% of those workers voted to join the union. Now, it's only a partial victory because the employer left town, but it established a benchmark for others. Unions are trying new things, following some successful actions in the US. Ontario teachers allied with parents in a public relations fight to fight back takeaways in the education sector. And even though they're not organized, we've seen actions at newer employers like Amazon, Facebook, and Google, where workers have taken collective action. And my question is, how will unions rise to this challenge? Will they try to organize in the traditional way? Will there be new forms of unionization? But I believe there is a moment for collective action. We've seen it with Black Lives Matter, most recently the Me Too movement, struggles for environmental justice, Indigenous struggles, democracy movements, and we don't know what workplace actions are yet to come. And just lastly, the pandemic, I believe, creates opportunities. It once again put a spotlight on inequality. If you're a racialized person and you're poor, the pandemic is more likely to come for you. If you're a poor senior in a group home, they're more likely to come for you. And it's like, you know, we all have the right to sleep under a bridge, but only some people accept that right. We see a change in the view of the role of government, where governments for decades now have said, we can't do anything. We can't increase spending. We have to balance the books. Government can't intervene. It's better if the private sector does it. Nothing can change. And then suddenly everything can change. And government not only can play a role, but does play the key role in health and income support. And now we'll have a debate. Our former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who is never at a loss for right-wing rhetoric, says we should return right away to austerity. And I think there's going to be a debate. All the millennials, for example, who were told government can't do anything, they may have a different opinion about what government can do and should do. Does anybody think we're just going to go back to nursing homes for seniors as they were before? But nothing happens without a struggle. But I think that what is changing right now is, in spite of Margaret Thatcher's message in the 1980s that there is no alternative to neoliberal capitalism, that there is the possibility of the restoration of hope. And where you have hope and the ability of people and the willingness of people to show up in person, to demonstrate, to act collectively, I believe there is the possibility of resistance and change. So yes, strikes, and who knows, we'll have to see. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Peggy. David Rapaport, over to you. I have to unmute you. There you go.
Here we go. Did you see that? Anyway, I wanted to, when I first saw this panel that I was on, I approached it from two entirely separate ways. And on the one hand, I looked at the shrinking of I just took a look at the shrinking of strike activity, strike lockout activity in Canada over the last 4 decades. And here's what I came up with. I went to 2 StatsCan websites. You can see them there. And in 1980, according to their research, Canada lost 9.13 million workdays due to strike lockouts. And in 2019, we lost 1.3 million. Factor in, I was thinking of the notion of inflation here, that the labor market has increased substantially over those 40 years. So yes, it's decreased by at least one order of magnitude in terms of the number of work that we lost. But what I really wanted to talk about here was the in the public sector. I come out of the public sector. I was, as Bob pointed out, and this is where I met Bob in OPSEU. I was with OPSEU for 25 years in leadership positions, organizing positions, steward positions, etc. And I wanted to talk about what's going on in the public sector. So I'm not addressing John's paper directly, but I did want to just look at what's going on in the public sector and find some element of other route that can be taken, as well as some notion of being positive about this. Just to start, collective bargaining and strikes in the public sector have a different history than found in the private sector. As we know, bargaining and the right to strike came later for workers in the public sector. It's common acceptance to locate the start of free collective bargaining in Canada in the mid-1940s. We all know this, PC 1003 in 1944, recognizing the legitimacy of bargaining agents, and of course the Rand formula, recognizing the need for union security through the dues checkoff. Labor found its place in the world of legitimacy at that point. It came later in the public sector. I think one of the main reasons for that was that governments were hesitant, reluctant to grant those rights to their own workers. Full collective bargaining in the public sector came between the 1970s and the 1990s. This was partially a result of a rise of worker militancy in the public sector, workers who watched their wages shrink in comparison to unionized workers in the private sector. Teachers in Ontario received the right to strike in 1975, 2 years after a one-day province-wide walkout. OPSEU direct government workers, which is where I come from, received the right to negotiate a full collective agreement, a more contained, non-legislated management rights clause, the right to negotiate superannuation and the organization of work, including tech change, and the right to strike in 1993. Ironically, at the same time, the Ontario government was curtailing public sector bargaining rights through austerity measures and legislation. Yes, but here lies the major difference. The government is not a profit-seeking enterprise, but this is a very, very limited definition of government, but I'm using it in an opportunistic way here. It's not a profit-seeking enterprise, but a wide encompassing sovereign organization project that is elected, answerable to voters and taxpayers, and responsible for developing and implementing social and economic policy, large-scale infrastructure, criminal law, and mediating class divisions, and a whole bunch of other things. What then is more democratic in that context? The rights of government to behave as sovereigns and manage the public sphere, or the rights of workers to engage in free collective bargaining? Sadly enough, that was an issue or an excuse for decades to limit collective bargaining rights for public sector workers. So in that context, the government is both the employer and the rules maker. Through labor relations legislation, governments determine the rules of bargaining and organizing new bargaining units. In Ontario, it is more specific. It is more specific for public sector workers in focused labor legislation, such as for Crown employees and for hospital workers. They have their own separate pieces of legislations. Governments can and do determine and declare essential work, and they do legislate the end of strikes periodically, and we do see that. In 2011, the Ontario government arbitrarily removed the right to strike for transit workers in Toronto, even though public transit does not come even close to any of the government's 4 categories of essential work. Danger to life, health or safety, destruction or serious deterioration of machinery, serious environmental damage, or disruption of the courts or legislative drafting. In its 1991 strike, PSAC workers were routinely and strategically declared essential in the middle of the strike against the Mulroney government. So here lies the difference. Public sector workers engage in strikes that appear more political than economic. They strike, or so they claim, on behalf of the public. We saw recently in Ontario how teachers ostensibly struck on behalf of students. Daycare workers strike on behalf of their charges. So the question I ask is, in a neoliberal context, is that an unreasonable claim? What then is the intersection or the correspondence between public sector workers as workers and as self-declared defenders of the social safety net? And that question hits a crescendo in the middle of a strike. In other words, do their working conditions correspond with the quality of the service supplied to the public? Thus, we witness public relations battles during strikes, a battle for the hearts and minds of the public. Striking workers and their unions struggle to weaken the legitimacy of sitting governments and thus weaken them for the next election. This is a different approach than found in strikes in the private sector, where each side tries to inflict economic harm on the other side. Governments attempt to demonize unions as striking workers as self-interested agents rather than protectors of the public good. And for those of us who are in Ontario, we saw that over approximately a 6-month period just before the pandemic, actually, with teachers. And furthermore, this marks a reconfiguration of workplace employer-employee relations and collective bargaining, not based on an internal economic imperative exclusively that defines dependency and power relations, but on an external imperative relating to the social welfare state apparatus. I want to turn to education strikes. We've seen this dynamic being played out in the United States and in Ontario last 3 to 5 years. We've seen this played out in several jurisdictions in the past few years by strikes in the education sector. The state and citywide strikes of teachers in the United States in the past 4 years, often during the life of a contract. Some examples in Oklahoma where there was opposition to a 4-day education week. West Virginia, twice. Once to oppose school privatization and charter schools. In Arizona, to restore education funding. Oakland, smaller class size, stop closing of schools in low-income neighborhoods and more oversight of charter schools. Chicago, smaller class size and investment in public housing. We saw these strikes in Colorado and North Carolina as well. The important point I want to make here is that these are public policy issues, easily understood and largely supported by the government. Ontario, there have been 2 province-wide strikes by teachers where this phenomenon was played out. There was a 2-week all-union province-wide strike in 1997 over Bill 160. Some of the main points: remove class size from the collective bargaining agenda, centralized taxation and governance, centralized control of funding, and reduce preparatory time for secondary school teachers. Interesting enough, in the middle of the strike, the government asked the courts to declare it an illegal strike. And I've always thought it was an illegal strike. And I remember discussions with the leaders of the unions at that time who were calling it a political action And I remember saying to them, gee, I don't know, in the world that I come from, when you withdraw labor, it's a strike, but I suppose it's a question of semantics. But the Judge McPherson ruled that the strike was not causing irreparable harm to students as required by the Education Relations Commission, which was established in 1975. And teachers maintained that it was a political strike. And they were winning the political battle. The public was going over to the teachers. The Premier Mike Harris knew that. But unfortunately, the teachers did not remain united, as the elementary teachers, after the second week, ended their participation and the strike unraveled. You know, whether it was won or lost, that's always a question of speculation and who you ask. Cuts did happen in special education, custodians, admin staff, etc. But an important point that's here is that you see a fragmentation and segmentation of bargaining rights in the public sector. You have 4 unions engaged separately, making their own decisions over one action, one political action. You find this kind of segmentation in several public sector environments, such as schools, universities, municipalities, hospitals, and direct government workers. I will not speculate as to why, but I do think that's an issue that needs to be addressed. There was a 4-union rotating provincial strike in Ontario in 2019-2020. Teachers opposed increases in class size and the extended use of web-based online teaching. The correspondence is also apparent here. Smaller classes and fewer web-based courses translate into greater job security for teachers and for better educational settings. Again, teachers did receive significant public support during the rotating strike. 2 recurring themes in all of these strikes: government efforts to limit and reduce education costs to pave the way for tax cuts, and the public generally sided with the teachers. So in a sense, the strikes acted as a vehicle, as a lightning rod for opposing austerity, not just among striking workers, but amongst the public as well. Public sector employers worry about profits. Private sector employers, worry about profits. Public sector employers worry about their budgets and re-election. This distinction is more poignant in a neoliberal context of austerity. As governments roll back the social safety net, public education, and social infrastructure in general, there are 2 classes of victim: the workers who perform the work by providing the service, and the public. Does that overlap create a natural alliance, a progressive alliance between public sector unions and the public, particularly those parts of the public who are more dependent on public services? Does this trend set the stage for a more political type of collective bargaining and for social unionism in general? I would argue at this point, mixed, the jury's still out on that, but we saw with these strikes in the education sector in the United States and in Ontario, the answer would certainly be a partial yes, they did.
David, could you just do a quick wrap up? I think
I'm doing that right now. I'm in my last, I need about another 30 seconds here, Bob.
Okay.
These points are not particularly new, I recognize that. How public sector unions and their membership exercise functions beyond collective bargaining. This intersection is now pressing in regards to police unions, particularly in the United States, where the call for expulsion from the AFL-CIO is growing. In this context, the intersection is not a correspondence, but a contradiction, where teachers can reasonably claim that the exercise of their collective bargaining rights is a reinforcement of community social needs and value. It's not the case for police unions and their efforts to protect their members. Indeed, in Black and other racialized communities, it has the opposite effect. So I'll just leave that for now.
Thank you very much, David. Roxane, it's yours.
Okay, so thanks so much. You should be hearing me and seeing me now, so all good? Excellent. Okay, so what I'm going to do is share maybe one specific case study. So I work at Unifor. I'm Unifor's Director of Strategic Planning, which means that I'm involved in many ways in the union's large campaigns and kind of important fights that are going on at the moment, which is very diverse, and so it's hard to pinpoint it a little bit more than that. But I want to talk about a lockout that happened at the Co-op refinery in Regina, Saskatchewan. And what I thought I'd do is just share some of the characteristics of that lockout, share a little bit of a sense of the timeline, what happened, and then some of the lessons that we sort of got from that. It's still pretty early in that process because although it's a lockout that lasted 6 months, it was just resolved a couple of weeks ago. And so we are still in the process to kind of evaluate and understand and share some lessons, but that's what I thought I would do today. So first of all, the Co-op refinery is a large workplace in Regina, Saskatchewan. It is an oil and gas workplace where we have roughly 800 members in the bargaining unit. They work different jobs within that refinery. It's very large, and just to give you a bit of a geographical orientation, it's on several dozens of acres, so it's a huge area, and there are multiple entryways. This is important when you're holding a strike to know what kind of workplace you're trying to prevent access to, and it was a bit of a tricky one for this one. And the last thing I want to say just before I get into the timeline is that, Unifor is a union representing 315,000 members across the country. We have a number of staff, leadership, we have local unions, and this particular struggle involved so many people in our union. So while I'm sharing this story, please know that, it was many, many hands on deck to get this lockout kind of resolved. And a huge props to the local union, which is Unifor 594, which is full of excellent trade unionists who have gone through a very, very difficult period over the last 6 months. So let me give you a sense of the timeline. On January 31st, 2019, the collective agreement between Co-op Refinery and the local expires, which means that the bargaining kind of is ongoing and starts. We know at that point that the key sticking points are going to be changes in pensions, which the Co-op Refinery wants to impose. So almost a full year later, the Co-op refinery serves a 48-hour lockout notice to Unifor after receiving a strike notice from the union. And then 2 days later, the lockout begins. And it's about 800 workers are locked out. And then the local holds a rally immediately and pledged to fight to the bitter end, which they turned out they were right. On December 9th, so one of the things that we knew even heading into the lockout is that the employer had been for months building camps inside of the periphery of the refinery, which, as I said, is a huge territory, so that they could house scab workers in case of a strike or lockout. And so they had planned for this. And so if anybody can give us a sense of how that is legal, that would be helpful, because the understanding is that that's a very, very good indication of bad faith bargaining. They were knowingly essentially building infrastructure so that they could house replacement workers in the case of strike or lockout. And so just looking at my timeline here, so on December 9th, the co-op confirmed that it was using helicopters to fly staff and resources over the picket line. So as you all know, the point of a strike or a lockout is to stop production, is to bring some ability for the workers to have some power in the negotiation and make sure that there is something that they can withhold, which is their labor. And so while there was picket lines around the refinery, the employer had access to helicopters to bring in their scab workers. So again, whether that's a fair situation or not is, for us, it's pretty clearly unfair. So on December 15th, Unifor National essentially launched a nationwide boycott of Co-op Refinery, which is obviously a very hard thing to do. In Western Canada, the Co-op brand is very present. There's grocery stores, there's gas stations, there's all sorts of affiliated kind of storefronts that people access, and so it was the boycott was in some way a way of attracting some pressure. Now, the next few weeks, there's court proceedings that begin, or rather the co-op sought an injunction against the local for preventing access to the workplace, even though they were locked out. That was imposed, and so I won't get into too much detail, but we got to a point where the local was allowed to picket, but they had to let in trucks go in every 10 minutes, and so that was the injunction that for a while was kind of respected. On January 8th, this is when Unifor National called for national solidarity efforts for members from across the country to come to Regina and to support the picket line. And so it was a national, it kind of kicked up the struggle into a bit of a national media just attention, trying to draw attention to what was going on. And a few weeks later, and I can, part of why I wanted to attest to this is just because I was there, and so I can share some of the experiences from our time in Regina there. But on January 20th, after some escalation where you know, the picket line had stopped those trucks from coming in, there was huge police presence on the picket line, and the police arrested our national president, Jerry Dias, which I know we were just talking about strikes in the 1970s, so that's something that hasn't happened in Canada in a while. And 13 other union members were also arrested. So I'm just going to pause here. Of course, we had lots of dealings with the Regina Police and with the RCMP during this strike, and I think there are a lot of lessons to get from that. Trade unionists are not strangers to the militarization of police and the brutal impacts that they may have on undermining picket lines and undermining workers' rights generally. And so we experienced this directly in Regina in January of this year. Okay, so then in terms of the timeline, obviously things were pretty poisonous here. At this point, it's hard to have a conversation when you're being arrested and when the police are basically bringing out their entire riot gear on a picket line, which is, you know, a right in Canada to picket. So things continue. I'm going to skip over here because, of course, this is a 6-month process. But obviously the arrest had a lot of solidarity that was generated from that. So for the next few weeks, we had rallies every day on the picket line. Other labor unions were joining us. Other members of the community were joining us. These workers were essentially fighting for some of the best jobs that are available in Regina. And it was becoming very clear that the employer was not really interested in negotiating a fair contract, that they were simply trying to get around the union, and that they were getting help from the police to do that. And so so later in January, bargaining did resume, and there were some conditions set. So the employer wanted the barricades out, and the union was asking for a stop in scab workers, replacement workers being brought into the workplace. That never happened. They continued to bring in scabs even throughout the pandemic, later on in the timeline. And so on February 1st, the talks broke off again, and we were back to doing regular solidarity action. On February 3rd, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh visited the picket line. That is great to get, of course, some political support on a picket line. And parallel, Premier Scott Moe offered a special mediator if the barricades come down. So this is another one of the lessons here, is that the provincial government throughout this lockout definitely shown that they were on the side of prolonging the lockout and helping the employer kind of achieve their goals. And I say that because if it had been a strike, and if it had been, you know, something that was deemed to be on the backs of workers, they, I think, would have passed back to work legislation in a much more speedy fashion. And in this case, the Moe government was very inactive in trying to find a solution, and always definitely trying, siding with the employer. So I'm just going to skip out until March. I mean, lots of things are happening. There's a lot of back and forth. Throughout the process, there was a lot of feelings within the local union that they were being disrespected. The employer was not taking bargaining proposals seriously. They were sticking to their original proposals and never necessarily moving forward. And so there was a moment in March where there was a bit of a final offer suggested, and the workers voted it down, which meant that the bargaining process had to continue. At some point, there was also a mediator that was brought in to try and bring parties together. The members of, in March, so later in March, the members of the local voted 98% in favor of Reddy's recommendation. It did not necessarily end up, getting closer to an agreement just based on the company's behavior. Let's see here. So then obviously later in March, we're now dealing with the pandemic. There's obviously an oil price war as well, which reduced demands. The employer announced 25% of its cuts in its typical production. So that is kind of adding to the context as well. April 29th, 89% of locked out Unifor Local 594 members vote to reject the co-op refineries complex, or the co-op refineries final offer. And then there's some back and forth. One of the things that we found out in May is that Regina Police Chief the police services had information about a bomb threat that was made against Unifor pickets in February, and they had not shared the information with the picketers. So that was also something just to indicate kind of how difficult the situation was. So there were threats made to the security of picketers, and the police never shared that information. So, while in May, much later, the police said that the threats may not have been credible, but that they should have notified the union and the refinery, which they didn't do. So finally, we get to June 18th. There's an announcement of a tentative deal that has been reached. And then on June 22nd, members of Unifor voted in favor of a new contract. There's a lot in that timeline. It included a lot of back and forth. One of the main lessons that we're holding here is that the co-op never wanted a contract. I think that people were happy in the end with getting a settlement or getting a contract, the union not being busted. And so it's not like they were on lockout forever. They were able to hold on to some of the things that they were fighting. But this brings a lot of questions about how fair the kind of situation that these workers were put in. The employer wanted to get rid of the union. The laws, the government, and the many levels of police actually helped the employer to get around the union and to turn this legally binding bargaining process into a vicious, harmful situation. Now, one thing that is clear is that the level of solidarity and support that was built by Local 594 was something that is unprecedented, and I know that many of them had some difficult time, but they are the people that really they faced off an oil company, essentially one of the country's richest companies, and fought really until the bitter end, and did such a great job doing that. So I guess my questions or my kind of comments here are just to say there has got to be a better way. There has got to be some conditions imposed on employers and enforcement when they don't meet those conditions. And of course, for us, this situation also brings up the question of anti-scab legislation and the employer's ability to just bring in replacement workers to undermine the collective bargaining process and to undermine the union in place. So I hope that serves as an interesting case study for the conversation that we're having today, and I'm happy to take any questions or to continue the conversation.
Thank you very much, Roxane, and all the participants. questions. I'm opening the floor up for questions. Use the chat function and you'll be recognized. You can direct your questions generally or to one of the panelists. Any questions? Jen, did you have something? I saw a hand go up.
That was my excellent job.
Oh, okay. That was the clapping. Okay, Dion. Dion Polar has a question.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I was in another meeting and I joined this session late, but what I ended up hearing at the end was excellent. I have a question for Roxane. I am just wondering about, so the co-op is an interesting case study because it is not sort of your stereotypical kind of corporation, right? Owned by sort of by shareholders. And so what do you find like in the sense of sort of the interaction with the governance structure of the co-op, right? Which is owned by, like Federated is owned by 200 retails across Western Canada, which are owned by sort of the individual consumers in Western Canada. And so I'm just wondering, you know, is there sort of any kind of interaction there or any kind of like difference and what the dynamics, because when I sort of look at these kinds of things, these labor disputes that have been happening in the co-op and the sort of call-in chats and that kind of thing on radio stations, there is a very different kind of debate going on around it than there is when it's like Walmart or something like that. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that aspect of it.
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're right. The governance structure is a little bit different, and you know, I'm not from Western Canada, but having had a chance to learn a little bit about the history of the co-op through this dispute, it was part of what made the workers and the members of Unifor 594 so upset is that the origins of the co-op and having a refinery that is owned by in a cooperative structure was to ensure the food and energy security of the communities across Western Canada, and that was really kind of the history. Now, I think the consensus is that there's been a little bit of a, through time, there's been a little bit of a corporate takeover of the structure, and so even though there's the remnants of a co-op structure, it is run essentially like a multinational corporation, and it's fully profit driven, and so. Case in point is that would an actual co-op lead their employers through a 6-month brutal lockout? I think that if the co-op structure was intact, the answer would be probably closer to no. So I think part of that too is that I know that there's a lot of organizing around trying to take back the kind of co-op structures, but and there's a democratic process in that, but it is quite a complicated structure. They have there's various co-ops that are members of the federated co-ops, and so it's a huge map to try and figure out where are the seats that need filling and all that stuff. But it is definitely something that is different, in that the roots of it should have been something that would assist in enhancing workers' rights and making sure that working conditions are respected, but I don't think that that's the case.
Okay, thanks, Roxane. John Godard has a question.
Yeah, I just having to do with scabs. One of the things I teach in my course is that it's hard to use scabs where there are really highly skilled workers, especially if they're specific skills. And the co-op strike kind of left egg all over my face. How effective do you think the scabs actually were? I know that when we struck years ago and they scabbed my course, the students marched on the dean's office for charging them money for it. And I'm wondering if this sort of thing, if the co-op was actually able to run fairly effectively, or whether a lot of it was a bit of a sham.
I think because of the scabs, they were not running 100%, but they were running enough to make sure that they were producing some type of fuel, because they had trucks coming out of there, regularly. One of the big concerns that our members were bringing up is safety. This is a refinery. The whole thing could, produce, could be at huge risk if there are safety protocols that are not being respected. And in fact, there was a leak that happened during late in the lockout that actually resulted in hundreds of liters of oily kind of discharge being released into the environment. And so I can't, I don't know how it works in there, and so I can't attribute it 100% to what's going on. But they're the normal workers that are responsible for ensuring the safe functioning of the entire facility, which is massive and quite complex, are not there. And so, I think that safety, security, and the integrity of that operation is at risk when bringing in scab labor.
Just to follow up, to my horror, my wife was still using our co-op gas station during this break, and one of the problems they had was a shortage, and I think there was a general shortage of gasoline for a while because of the strike. So, I mean, whether this was before they actually had the scabbed operation up and running, I don't know. But if I'm right here, I think there was a genuine effect, and I'm in Winnipeg, right? So it may be that nobody ever comes to Winnipeg, including gasoline, if we can avoid it. But we seem to have a shortage. Actually, the virus didn't come here recently. So anyway.
Roxane, it's Peggy. I'd like to know how the boycott went and what kind of public support there was for the workers. I haven't been to the refinery often. These places are fairly remote, and that can be a bit discouraging for people. Obviously, it wasn't in this case. There was tremendous solidarity, but I'm just wondering how were people in Saskatchewan, and how was the media?
So I think this is always the challenge with launching a national boycott, is that it's very hard to know sometimes how, what the impact of it is. I know that we had a petition going, and so there was good traction with that. And one of the things that was happening during the lockout is that people were taking photos of their co-op membership cards and just saying that they were kind of done with it, just like you said, John, that they were, just kind of throwing the towel on the co-op and making that part of their action a little bit more public. But it's very hard to know, what the impact on the bottom line is. And while this kind of lockout, you can imagine that there's multiple pressure points, and it's not a single thing that's going to end it or make it work. And so it's likely that it was a combination of all of these various actions, including the solidarity action in person, the picket line, including major mistakes by the Regina police. Like, they're arresting our national president caused so much solidarity for us and so much support for the union. And so I'm sure that had they thought about it 5 minutes, they would have probably proceeded differently. But so it's hard to know exactly what the impact of the co-op is. I think that the whole point was to tarnish the brand a little bit, and I know that with a lockout that lasts 6 months, it's hard not to do that, because there was quite a bit of a vocal kind of rage against the co-op during that time. And overall, I mean, the media, I think, were following the story a lot. There was there was a lot of media attention to it, both from kind of local newspapers and the CBC Radio Canada outlets. And so, so I think as I say, I think it was one piece of the puzzle, but, in the end, it's hard to tell how much pressure it has.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I have a question. We've got about 5 minutes left or so. This is for both Peggy and David. I sensed a note of optimism in both of your presentations, having to do with perhaps a new role of government, as Peggy pointed out, and David's new appreciation for public sector workers. Right? Is there a potential? Was I right that there's a hint of optimism in your approaches? Because we can all use some optimism.
You want to go first, Peggy?
Oh, sure. I mean, I always say you've got to be a naive optimist if you run for politics and get active in the labor movement. But yeah, I'm optimistic because I think that first of all, the neoliberal capitalism has given it its best shot. Like, it has thrown everything at reducing wages and creating insecurity for workers. And I think that the result is that, well, some people, I agree with John, that some people will just go shopping and raise hell on a Friday night. But I think that, I look at young people today. That's who I'm looking at. And I look at the actions of demonstrators and movements that are taking place. And then I went out to some of the events for the Fedora workers. Now, if you ever wanted a David and Goliath struggle, there's one for you. And against all odds, these people stood up for their rights, and it was a partial victory. In Saskatchewan with the lockout, Jerry Dias always says, one day longer, that the union will be there one day longer from whatever the employer has to throw at it. I don't think it's Pollyanna to say that resistance doesn't go away. And I think that it is taking new forms. I don't think the strike will disappear, but I am optimistic that there is an evolution taking place. And I mean, who knows? We may end up with 30 more years of austerity, but somehow I don't think so. So I'm optimistic.
Thank you.
I'm not sure. I agree with Peggy. You have to be optimistic, or you're not going to engage in this kind of exercise or work for sure, or else you're just not going to bother. But there are 3 points I jotted down. First of all, when I was thinking about the roles of what some of the education unions were doing in Ontario and in the States, I was thinking, and this is going to be the subject of another session, I noticed, and how do we break the shackles of the Wagner model in terms of, are we just going to focus on just who our direct employer is and not consider other aspects of life? And clearly we have to look at broader models, sectoral, universal, social, whatever you want to call it, in terms about how we go about doing things. And I think in the public sector, this becomes more so when you see a fragmentation of bargaining. I know with OPSEU, for example, you go into some hospitals, you see a unit from CUPE, you see a unit from OPSEU, you see a unit from SCIU, you see a unit from ONA, and you just wonder, how do you create any kind of how do you create real solidarity in that kind of a setting? I want to see, I'd like the notion of expanding bargaining from just compensation and wage issues. Clearly, that have to be a part of it, and recognize that there are other aspects of compensation, particularly things like the social wage that we find in the social safety net, which creates a foundation for it, and that there are other factors in collective bargaining. So I suppose my optimism is the fact that when you see teachers in Chicago going out and striking for more public housing, and you see teachers in California and Oklahoma, striking for putting limitations on charter schools and privatization of education, yeah, I suppose those are grounds for optimism.
Thanks. I'd like to, I just missed his entry here. Chris Roberts has a question. He got it in there just after I asked mine. Chris, are you still there?
Not sure if you can hear me okay, Bob.
Yes, I can.
So my question is just around follow up on Dion's question with respect to Western Canadian cooperativism and what the dispute revealed about the evolution of co-ops there. It just has to do with the Saskatchewan NDP. This is a question for Roxane. I'm curious if she could offer some candid reflections on the role that the NDP played provincially in providing a counterbalance, effective or otherwise, to the Saskatchewan Party.
I think that, you know, from our perspective as a labor union, we always prioritize workers' rights and advancing the interest of workers. And so I think that, you know, of course, a strike and a lockout is a tense situation. And a lot of non-union workers don't necessarily understand the process that is involved in being on strike, or what is the difference in being locked out. And so, you know, that's partly what a union is to make sure that our members are aware and understand what is their ability to bring balance to the bargaining process by withholding their labor. But we also know that that's sometimes a conversation that's difficult to have with the public. I think that if there's any, you know, lessons for many of us, and including anybody who's interested in moving forward the interest of workers, is that there are no, you know, in this situation, anti-scab labor would have helped the lockout, right? Or anti-scab legislation. And so if it's, during the lockout, the Saskatchewan NDP said that they should consult, or they weren't too sure about how they felt about anti-scab legislation, which I understand. It's a difficult place. It's a strike and lockout is difficult. But in these cases, it's when the choice is 800 locked out members who have good jobs that are not available, you know, in many other places in Saskatchewan, and on the other side you have an employer that is really just trying to bust the union. It seems like the lines are pretty clear. And so, and I think that often working people will find that they are not necessarily heard or reflected when advancing their rights are not necessarily, you know, taken up politically. And so I think that that's a huge opportunity. We live in a time where workers' rights are fully under attack, and we're going through a pandemic, and we don't know what the next stage of you know, our work and our labor relations and our ability to have decent jobs in Canada looks like. And so what a great time to push, you know, for an agenda that actually helps workers.
Thank you for that. John Godard had a quick question.
Yeah, actually,
or
just
comment.
two quick questions. Unless I've missed this, and it could be I have, there are some half measures about scabs in the country. And one is the federal government at least used to have a law that it was an unfair labor practice if it was deemed that you were using a strike to break a union. I don't know exactly how that's ever played out. Manitoba, we have a 60-day rule where in theory you can go to the government after 60 days and have them send in a mediator, and I'm not sure, maybe even an arbitrator. It may actually be arbitration. It's been a while since I've looked at this. And both of these were compromises to having anti-scab legislation, which just wasn't politically viable at the time. And in the federal case, it was the Liberals. In Manitoba case, it was the NDP. The other point I have is that we're missing out, and this is a sin because our moderator was a big player here. Courts, that's the, I mean, I know this isn't transforming the world, but the Supreme Court decisions have been very, very favorable. And we recently had a Court of Queen's Bench decision against a wage freeze, which was essentially imposed on public sector workers here. Essentially, it was scathing. I mean, I've never heard anything like it. It was like almost like a decision, almost a hate letter towards the government side. So our public sector was too weak or too timid to strike when this happened. Our union wasn't at the university, but we lost our shirts on it. But there is the option of the courts, which seem increasingly to be friendly. And I think this could quite easily spill over into rulings about strikes. certainly they're an alternative to striking.
My only comment on that is that I'll be talking about that Saturday morning,
Okay.
about the most recent decision, my freedom of association discussion. But I think Dion had another question. I don't know if it was answered, Dion.
Yeah, no, I think Roxane, you know, she acknowledged, I mean, I think that this is it's one of those things about sort of this, do you take the strategic approach, right? Or does the union support the workers? And I think Roxane answered it. One of the things that I would actually just, because I've done some research on federated, and just in the context of the provincial NDP question, you know, a lot of the CEO of FCL and also a lot of the senior executives were very involved in the NDP. Maybe this was raised earlier in the talk, but I mean, one of the things I will say is I don't know that that necessarily would have been their goal, about like to completely bust the union. I mean, these are people who really, I think, actually have historically anyways, I mean, unless they've completely changed, like believed in unions and in sort of the progressive movement. And I think that's why they've been involved in co-ops, right? Which is, so I think there's this interesting dynamic that we have to talk about here when it comes to sort of the labor relations in co-ops. And that comes back to my first question for Roxane, that I don't know that we're grappling with in this particular case. And I think it's really critical. And I think it comes to some of the maybe back and forth too that Roxane and I were having in the comment section. So just, it's a comment. I don't really know any more than that.
Okay, we're just about at the end here. Any other questions? I don't see any.
I just want to pipe in and say what a shame, what a missed opportunity for the NDP provincially in Saskatchewan. I know it's a tough place for progressive politics, in spite of the history there, but one thing I know is when you're on a picket line, you remember who's there with you. And it just seems like a missed opportunity. So anyway, I'm glad you raised that.
I think good point. Well, I'd like to thank you all for this, especially the panel members for their presentations, excellent presentations, and for keeping the time. But I think it was a good session. Thank you very much. And enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Bob. You hear me? Am I muted? I'm muted.